their homes affects the whole world: Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and now Europe. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta for the statement. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Institute.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, International IDEA strongly condemns the unprovoked war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation with the involvement of Belarus against Ukraine, a sovereign nation and a democracy. This is in breach of international law and international agreements and a rules-based international order that underpins the shared objective of global peace and the existence of organizations such as International IDEA. The invasion order by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. As firm believers in the rights of people to exercise their fundamental rights and freedoms, we convey our full support to and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. They are innocent victims of this aggression. We salute the brave partners and democracy activists with whom International IDEA has engaged in recent years when Ukraine made huge progress towards being a stable and thriving democracy. We call on the international community to spring into action to protect them and mitigate the humanitarian consequences of the invasion. We cannot fail to note that the military operation was launched while the UN Security Council was meeting to discuss the crisis. We reiterate our firm belief that international crises should be addressed through the means of multilateral diplomacy and resolved on the basis of the principles of the Charter. It is particularly unfortunate that this naked rejection of these principles happens during a pandemic that has rendered evident the need for increased global cooperation to make the world governable and to achieve justice for all. In these days, we are witnessing what an unchecked ruler
That is why our predecessors created the United Nations. And yet today, it falls to us to save future generations. Let me read the following text. Our position is that whatever grievances a nation may have, however objectionable it finds the status quo, aggressive warfare is an illegal means for those grievances or for altering those conditions. It may be that the nation faced desperate problems that would have warranted the boldest measures short of war. All other methods, persuasion, propaganda, economic competition, diplomacy, were open to an aggrieved country. But aggressive warfare was outlawed. The defendants did make aggressive war a war in violation of treaties. They did attack and invade their neighbors in order to effectuate a foreign policy which they knew could not be accomplished by measures short of war. And that is as far as we accuse or propose to inquire. End of quote. Said in his opening statement to the International Military Tribunal on November 21, 1945, in the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, Justice Robert Jackson, Chief of Counsel. And these words are addressed today to Mr. Putin, Mr. Shoigu, Mr. Lavrov, Mr. Volodin, Ms. Matvienko, and perhaps dozens more, but certainly they are not addressed to the Russian citizens, those Russian citizens who try to preserve their dignity. For almost a week, Ukraine is fighting under the bombs and missiles, fighting in the face of armadas of hardware and countless crowds of enemies. They have come to the Ukrainian soil not only to kill some of us, not only to shift our course and priorities. They have come to deprive Ukraine of the very right to exist. They have come to resolve the Ukrainian issue, as their propagandists claimed. Just stop and think whether these words remind you of something. Yes, more than 80 years ago, another dictator tried to finally resolve the issue of another people. He failed. When the world responded in a resolute and united manner, it was happened immediately, and the delay costed dozens of millions of people. Are we ready to pay such a price now? Or is it time to demonstrate the unity of purpose and deeds already now? We appreciate all manifestations of such unity and solidarity with Ukraine. I would like to express gratitude to all member states that support Ukrainians in their battle for freedom. I would also like to thank those member states that accepted Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and children. More than 500,000 have already fled from Russian missiles and shells. I will not recite all facts of new war crimes and crimes against humanity that the Russian troops have committed since my previous statement 2 days ago. The list is so long that it will run out of time. The crimes are so barbaric that it is difficult to comprehend. Facing the total resistance of the Ukrainian population, Putin's regime has proceeded to widespread use of indiscriminate weapons such as multiple rocket launchers and aerial bombs against the residential areas. Ukrainians are being killed by Russian ballistic missiles and thermobaric weapons. Just yesterday, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zhytomyr, Mariupol, Melitopol, and many other cities and towns sustained heavy shellings that killed dozens of innocents, including children. Ukraine deeply regrets that a student from India has become a victim of this shelling by the Russian armed forces in Kharkiv. We offer our deepest sympathies to India and the relatives of the victim. A Chinese citizen was also injured in another Ukrainian city because of Russia's deadly attacks. The Ukrainian and foreign citizens have become hostages of the Russian armed aggression against Ukraine. In Kyiv, Russian murderers hit the city TV tower, killing 5 passerbys. One of the missiles dropped on the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial, a sacred place of commemoration of Jews, Ukrainians, Roma, and representatives of other ethnic groups killed by Nazis during the World War II. What an irony when victims of Nazis are being killed for the second time by Nazi modern followers. As the president of Ukraine asked, what was the point of repeating the slogan, never again in 80 years? It's already clear that the goal of Russia is not an occupation only. It is genocide. On 7th and 8th of March 2022, the International Court of Justice will hold public hearings in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. Also, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has decided to proceed with opening of a formal investigation into the situation in Ukraine. Unprovoked escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine gives reasons to believe that crimes within the jurisdiction of the ICC continue to be committed on the territory of Ukraine. Along with the situation in Crimea and Donbass, recent events suggest that aggressors' troops continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. Dear colleagues, one might consider observing the bloodshed in Ukraine that it is not my war. It is a mistake. The evil will never stop. It requires more and more space to conquer. If tolerated, it advances further and further. The draft resolution is one of the building blocks to build a wall to stop it, to stop in Ukraine and not to let it go further. The wall that will protect all of you, in particular, younger generations. Distinguished delegates, by voting today, you also reconfirm your country's commitment to the UN Charter. After the vote, I invite you, ambassadors and representatives, to stop by the Indonesian lounge and to sign this little blue book. Little but of global magnitude. Every vote in favor of the resolution and every signature of country that voted in favor would be a historical reconfirmation of the Charter. It is very easy, ladies and gentlemen, to sign the Charter at time of peace. It is the duty to sign and reconfirm and implement the Charter at the time of war. So stop by the Indonesian lounge, put the name of your country if you voted in favor, and after you sign this book, I will hand it over to the Secretary General for keeping the book in his office, in front of him. So at every single moment, the Secretary General will get an inspiration from the overwhelming majority of nations who still trust in the UN, who still trust in the UN Charter. There is a very fragile gentleman, a very old one. He was born in a territory that was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. He will celebrate his 102 years birthday in 9 days. His name is Benjamin Ferenc. Benjamin Ferenc was an investigator of war crimes, a chief prosecutor at one of the 12 subsequent trials of Nuremberg. Later, he became an advocate of international rule of law and for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. With the permission of the producer, I would play a couple of seconds of his words. And I want you to listen very carefully.
Hard to do. 3 words: law, not war. If you can do that, you save every day billions of dollars, which you can use to deal with the legitimate complaints of old people who need medical care, students who have to pay for their tuition, all the legitimate complaints which could be solved if we didn't spend the money on weapons to kill them instead of helping them. And that is the current system. Now, how are you going to do it? I will end by telling you how to do it and the principles which have guided me. There are 3 principles. 1, never give up. 2, never give up. 3, I hear you, never give up. Good luck. I wish you the best of luck.
Please show respect. Show respect to the Charter. Show respect to the Secretary General. Show respect to this gentleman who will celebrate 102 years since his birthday. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Before I open the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
господин председатель.
President, Secretary General, colleagues, Russia would ask for this draft resolution to be put to the vote. And we call on you not to support this draft. However, we know about the unprecedented pressure that our Western partners are exerting on a large number of countries, urging them to vote as they see fit. This is not something even that we can call pressure. It was open and cynical threats, and we know about it. This document will not allow us to end military activities. On the contrary, it could embolden and Kiev radicals and nationalists to continue to determine the policy of their country at any price, holding peaceful civilians hostage, but not in the figurative sense of the term, but in the literal sense of it. Now, that is what is happening in a series of cities in Ukraine where people are being used as human shields. Today, we've learned that in the Ukrainian military are not allowing citizens of Mariupol to leave the city. They are keeping them there, including women and children there in one of the schools in Mariupol, and forcing them, turning back all civilians who are trying to leave the city along humanitarian corridors. We also know about planned nationalist battalions who are planning provocations, which they have been preparing with the participation of civilians so that then they can accuse Russia of having carried them out. Running against norms of international humanitarian law, and military hardware is being placed in residential areas, as well as rocket launchers and artillery. Today, we will provide examples of this to the UN leadership, who are still asserting that they don't have this kind of evidence, although videos taken by Ukrainian citizens are freely available on the internet. Responsibility for this fully lies with the Ukrainian authorities, much like for the irresponsible and criminal distribution of weapons to anyone who wants one, including those who have been released from prison. This has already led to many cases of robbery, murder, and plundering. Colleagues, your refusal to support today's draft resolution as a vote for a peaceful Ukraine free from radicalism and neo-Nazism, living in peace with its neighbors, and refusing to be managed from outside. This was the aim of our special military operation, who the sponsors of this resolution try to present as aggression. We heard from the Ukrainian representative words about Nazism, but he didn't mention the rampant neo-Nazism in Ukraine itself, and the rampant neo-Nazis and neo-nationalist radical organizations about torch-lit processions and those who support Hitler. Those who are interested in the development of the Ukrainian crisis and how it has developed very much understand where it came from. In actions today, we're trying to stop the 8-year war of the Maidan regime on the people of Donbass. Over the last years, our countries have done everything it can, and things are impossible to avoid this kind of scenario. We, according to the Secretary General, have left no stone unturned and knocked on every door. However, we were not listened to. Those living in Donbass are still being bombed. They don't plan on stopping at 14,000 victims, the vast majority of which are living in the LPR and DPR, were living in the LPR and DPR. The aim of our special operation is announced on the basis of Article 51 of the UN Charter and will be achieved. However, we are not carrying out strikes on civilian facilities and civilians. Don't believe the large number of fakes spread around the internet on this. These fakes have only are distributed like biscuits at operation centers, special operations of Ukraine, and this center was destroyed. A peaceful scenario for Ukraine could happen if the radicals concern about preserving civilian lives in their country and rather than hiding behind them. This is a call in the text before the vote. There is no reference to this call in the text before us to vote on. Nothing is mentioned about the illegal coup in Kiev in February 2014, with the connivance of Germany, France, and Poland, and with the support of the United States, where the legitimately elected president of the country was overthrown. This draft does not mention anything along the lines that the new nationalist authorities are limiting the rights of citizens to use the Russian language. This was a green light for a large chain of events of violations of the basic rights of those living in the east of the country, and not only in the east of the country, including the most valuable right, that right to life. Many of you don't want to hear about this, about the tragedies happening in Ukraine after the Maidan coup in 2014. And those people who burnt alive in Odessa, and the crimes of those who didn't agree, against those who didn't agree with them. And the most blatant example of this was the war against Donbass rolled out by Kiev. There's nothing in the document either that over the last 8 years, Europe and the US have been pumping the Ukraine with weapons so that those people can kill civilians in Donbass. And the loyal authorities in Kiev are fully ignoring the Minsk agreements and sabotaging Security Council Resolution 2202. Finally, this draft is a clear attempt of those who, over the last decades, have committed huge numbers of aggressions, illegal and international law, as well as coups, one of which indeed was the Maidan coup in Ukraine. They present themselves as champions of international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia.
Most sincerely regrets events taking place in the east of Europe. Russia and Ukraine have always been friendly country to the Republic of Serbia, and Serbian people perceives Russians and Ukrainians as fraternal nations. We felt loss of life of each man in Ukraine is true tragedy. The Republic of Serbia is committed to observing principles of territorial integrity and political independence of states as one of the basic principles of international law based on UN Charter and Final Act from Helsinki from 1975, which guarantees the right of states to inviolability of borders, just like it is committed to preservation of sovereignty and integrity of its own territory. The Republic of Serbia, likewise, advocating respect for territorial integrity of other sovereign nations, and regardless of not agreeing with all formulation stated in resolution, will vote in favor of resolution. I am obliged to point to PP 13 and remind that the first attack against a sovereign state on the soil of Europe after the Second World War took place not so long ago in 1999, when 19 countries attacked, at that time, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, primarily Republic of Serbia, when there was no appropriate reaction of such distinguished institution to this flagrant violation of UN Charter, despite the fact they still suffer from consequence of severe violation of fundamental principles of international law by others. Serbia is not giving up these principles even today. The Republic of Serbia will continue to advocate termination of conflicts, expecting that the parties will invest additional efforts into reaching diplomatic solution and creating conditions for peace throughout dialogue. Serbia will provide all kind humanitarian aid to endangered Ukrainian citizens while remaining committed to peace and consistent respect for international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Serbia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran, Sayyid Rais.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us today clearly represents a prejudiced attitude based on political propaganda. It's a means of political pressure. Those who prepared the draft resolution incorporated an aggressive language against the Russian Federation to belittle its legitimate stand based on its security concerns and its right to protect its people from the threats to national Russian security. Belarus is also impacted by this draft resolution. This draft resolution represents a flagrant political hypocrisy. Had the US and its Western allies been serious in de-escalating the situation, they would have fulfilled the promises they undertook 3 decades ago, not to expand EU and transform Ukraine into a continuous threat to the Russian Federation. And they should have pressured Ukraine to abide by Minsk and to stop the violations against the civilians in Donbass, let alone those countries' eagerness to supply Ukraine with heavy weaponry and missiles, encouraging volunteers to fight in Ukraine. This indicates the clear-cut desire of those countries for provocations and not for containment and de-escalation. This draft resolution coincides with a huge media campaign to spread erroneous information and lies. It's not designed to find a clear-cut and real solution for the crisis, rather to defame the Russian Federation. It is a text that is full of loopholes and untruths. It ignores the real reasons for the escalation of tension and for the eruption of hostilities. Those who are eager to defend the Charter of the United Nations now today, they should have shown the same eagerness vis-a-vis Israel's continued occupation of the Arab territories and the aggression committed by the Turkish forces against our territory. What about the US violations of the territorial integrity of our land, Syrian territories? Syria's rejection of Western hegemonistic policies and interference in the internal affairs of states, prolongating crises, promulgating and spreading anarchy, opting for double standards and selectivities, imposing unilateral sanctions, make it necessary for us to reject this draft resolution and vote against it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, it is clear from the debate over the past 2 days that the membership of the United Nations is united in its call to end the war in Ukraine and return to diplomacy. St. Vincent and the Grenadines wishes to offer an explanation of its vote on the draft resolution before us today. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines will vote in favor of the draft resolution. We will vote in accordance with our steadfast commitment to upholding the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, which form the core of multilateralism and gave birth to our United Nations 76 years ago. It bears repeating, Mr. President, that these principles underscore respect for sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states and enjoin member states to refrain from the threat or the use of force in the conduct of their international relations. Our support for the draft resolution is rooted in our conviction that the strict adherence to international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, and the principles of peace, dialogue, and compromise for the preservation of humanity is not optional. As a small island developing state, full compliance with the bedrock principles of international law remains an existential issue. We take the floor again, Mr. President, to repeat our call for these principles to be applied consistently and upheld as universal truths instead of selective, uneven, and unpredictable tools to further great power ambition anywhere and by anyone. Historically, and in recent times, we have witnessed the naked hypocrisy, double standards, and cynical misapplication of international law, which we have condemned. Today, we strongly emphasize that our august assembly should apply the fundamental principles of our charter impartially, irrespective of the size, economic, and military power of the principles involved. Mr. President, in the midst of prevailing global challenges, such as the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, we simply cannot afford another conflict. War does not manage grievances. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, therefore, calls for an immediate ceasefire to avert further bloodshed, human suffering, and a global catastrophe, and to engage in peaceful dialogue to find a solution to this war post-haste. Today, we must unite for peace. Thank you, and peace profound to all.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraph 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become the co-sponsors of A/ES11/L11, Barbados and Cambodia. If any other country wish to co-sponsor A/ES11/L1, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. There is nothing further, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. The result of The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 41, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Tunisia voted in favor of the draft resolution in support of the principles and values of the UN Charter on which our foreign policy is based. We would like to emphasize that the crisis must be settled by peaceful means, which is the ideal solution to prevent further aggravation of the situation and further human tragedy. The world witnessed so many grueling wars destructive to peace and security and the life of people. Our experience indicate that military options cannot solve any crisis. Dialogue and negotiations can settle all differences and finding compromises. The current crisis in Ukraine comes at a time the world was getting out of COVID-19 and prepare itself for a new stage based on solidarity, cooperation, and effective engagement in multilateral action and achieving our common agenda. We believe that the world cannot undertake or cannot burden itself by further crises. We encouraged the engagement of the parties in peaceful negotiations, and we urge the international community to intensify efforts to obligate these parties to resort to negotiations in a manner to cease hostilities and to prepare the way for finding permanent solution. Given the fact that international peace and security are a whole, Tunisia calls for dealing with all just questions in one standard so that peoples can regain their legitimate rights in accordance with international legitimacy to build a more stable, more peaceful world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its position on the vote we just cast. Rwanda voted in favor of this resolution to firmly support that sovereignty, independence, and interior integrity of any country must be respected. We supported this resolution to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, military escalation should cease immediately and go for peaceful settlement of the crisis. The Russian Federation and Ukraine have the key to resolve this conflict. The external intervention will only worsen the situation. Mr. President, we fully support international efforts to de-escalate the war, including the efforts of the Secretary General in solving the crisis. We urge all concerned parties to demonstrate calm and seek a solution to the conflict through dialogue to ensure that civilians do not continue to pay the heaviest price. A lasting solution, Mr. President, will only be achieved through dialogue by both parties, taking into account the concerns of both sides. The current war does not guarantee that it will bring peace. Instead, it's likely to generate subsequent crises and human suffering. Rwanda also expresses serious concern with the extent of humanitarian devastation and peace and security challenges caused by the conflict. We are also concerned by the reports that Africans are being racially segregated and denied safe exit and admission to neighboring countries. We call on all those who are involved to allow unhindered evacuation without looking at the color of origin of anyone. Mr. President, the founding principles of the United Nations Charter is to live peacefully with each other, uphold the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states while considering the security interests of other countries. Diplomatic options present the better solution to the sustainable peace. We call for open dialogue and negotiations in good faith. Finally, Mr. President, Rwanda calls for a sincere commitment to the United Nations Charter and international order. The ongoing crisis poses a severe threat to international peace and security. We encourage concerned parties to give a chance to peace. We wish to underline that a long-lasting solution to the current crisis primarily lands and is in the hands of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Dialogue is the only option to resolve the current crisis. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Rwanda, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there continues to be dramatic changes of the situation in Ukraine. What is now unfolding is indeed heart-wrenching. China's basic position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and unequivocal. We always believe that all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected, and that international disputes should be resolved peacefully in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. The top priority right now is to ease the situation on the ground as much as possible and prevent the situation from escalating or even getting out of control. Russia and Ukraine have already held their first round of negotiations. Despite their differences, both sides have shown their willingness to continue the negotiations. China welcomes this. Faced with the highly complex and sensitive situation, China once again calls on the international community to stick to the overall direction of a political settlement and foster an enabling atmosphere and conditions for direct dialogue and negotiations between the parties concerned. Mr. President, any action taken by the United Nations and the relevant parties should give priority to regional peace and stability and the universal security of all parties, and should play a positive role for de-escalation and diplomatic solutions. Regrettably, the draft resolution submitted to this emergency special session for vote has not undergone full consultations with the whole membership, nor does it take into full consideration the history and the complexity of the current crisis. It does not highlight the importance of the principle of indivisible security or the urgency of promoting political settlement and stepping up diplomatic efforts. These are not in line with China's consistent position. Therefore, we had no choice but to abstain in the voting. Mr. President, the final settlement of the Ukraine crisis requires abandoning the Cold War mentality, abandoning the logic of ensuring one's own security at the expense of others' security, and abandoning the approach of seeking regional security by expanding military blocs. It is important to give full attention and respect to the legitimate security concerns of all countries, and on that basis, conduct negotiations to put in place a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security mechanism. Blindly exerting pressure and imposing sanctions and creating division and confrontation will only further complicate the situation, result in a rapid spillover of the negative impact of the crisis, and affect even more countries. We call on the international community to take a responsible approach, promote the relevant parties to immediately return to the track of political settlement, and seek a comprehensive solution to the Ukraine issue through dialogue and consultation. China is ready to continue its constructive role in this regard. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I give the floor to the distinguished representative, Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, the delegation of Sierra Leone has requested for the floor to explain its position on the agenda item and vote on the resolution. The government of Sierra Leone is gravely concerned about the regrettable serious situation created in Ukraine with ramifications for regional and international peace and security. Sierra Leone also expresses serious concern over the growing refugee and humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, and particularly the safety and well-being of Sierra Leonean students in Ukraine. In appreciating efforts to provide the necessary safety and refuge, it is important for all those fleeing the conflict to be treated equally and with dignity, without discrimination, whether on the basis of race or status. A blanket denial is not the answer, nor representative of the values we seek to protect. Mr. President, Sierra Leone voted in favor of the resolution based on our fundamental belief in the sanctity of the United Nations Charter its principles, and the purposes of the organization. Our vote today is not a selective application of our fundamental belief in the principles of sovereign equality of all UN member states, the territorial integrity or political independence of member states, non-interference, and the peaceful settlement of dispute. Our vote today is not to absolve the actions and inactions of the United Nations, particularly in addressing peace and security questions in Africa. While we believe that the United Nations must be consistent in the application of its charter and in pursuit of its purposes, resorting to the threat or use of force and the violation of the territorial integrity of any member state inconsistent with the charter must be rejected. Sierra Leone accordingly calls for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also call for the immediate cessation of hostilities, and in this regard, we welcome the commencement of ceasefire talks, and we urge for the continuation of the talks in a meaningful way. Finally, we also urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand has carefully considered the draft and voted in support of the resolution because of the overriding importance that Thailand attaches to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and those of international law, in particular, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the non-use of force against states. Our support of the resolution also underlines our deep concerns for the plight of affected civilians and the humanitarian consequences of the hostilities and violence in the area. In this regard, we call on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. We are also concerned with the potential longer-term consequences on the rules-based international order and renew our call towards peace and for all parties to enhance dialogue through various means to truly realize a peaceful settlement of the situation. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, we recognize the exceptional circumstances we are all facing, and we share the conviction that the General Assembly could not remain silent. The resolution adopted this morning conveys a message, and Brazil has added its voice to that of other members. The adoption of this resolution by the General Assembly shows the unwavering commitment of the international community to upholding the core principles upon which the UN is built. We are appreciative of the attention given in different paragraphs of the text to the critical need to monitor and alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground. We also welcome the text for urging the parties to the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law, to guarantee the safety of civilians, as well as of humanitarian and medical personnel, and to facilitate unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The resolution as adopted, however, does not go far enough in underscoring that the cessation of hostilities is only a first step to achieve peace. Sustainable peace needs additional steps. In this respect, it is regrettable that the supportive role of the United Nations that the supportive role that the United Nations can and should play has been left by the wayside in the eagerness to point fingers. Yes, the resolution is a call for peace by the international community, but peace requires more than the silence of guns and the withdrawal of troops. The path to peace requires comprehensive work on the security concerns of the parties. The only precondition should be an immediate ceasefire. Mr. President, the resolution cannot be seen as permissive towards the indiscriminate application of sanctions and the deployment of arms. These initiatives are not conducive to the proper resumption of a constructive diplomatic dialogue and risk further escalating tensions with unpredictable consequences to the region and beyond. We also have concerns about preambular paragraph 15. It is not constructive at this moment fraught with danger in this particular resolution to comment on military measures adopted by any specific nuclear power, be it the Russian Federation or the members of NATO. Once effective negotiations do get started, all the parties must show true flexibility and spirit of compromise. Lasting solutions can only be achieved at the negotiating table through committed dialogue. Brazil continues to urge all actors to de-escalate and to renew efforts in favor of a negotiated diplomatic agreement between Ukraine and Russia that contributes to the establishment of the security and the stability of the region. We stand ready to resolutely work in favor of peace in the discussions in this Assembly, in the Security Council, and in other fora. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. This emergency special session comes as the conflict in Ukraine has reached a dangerous inflection point. The international community is alarmed by developments on the ground, and this is the clear message of today's resounding vote. The humanitarian situation is worsening by the day. We have seen reports of rapidly growing civilian casualties and massive displacement, the extent of which Europe has not experienced in decades. The UAE is deeply concerned by these developments. Our collective responsibility must, however, be towards exhausting all efforts and using all diplomatic channels to prevent a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. We remain firm in that belief more than ever before. Yesterday, the UAE pledged $5 million in response to the UN's humanitarian flash appeal. We know that in the days, weeks, and months ahead, more must be done. The credibility of this organization, born out of the ashes of World War II, rests on its universal representation and its effectiveness in applying the principles that we all uphold. However, as this conflict has revealed, the clear and full voice of the United Nations has only grown harder to summon because it is not equally applied. Despite deepening divisions, now is time to take a step back, identify diplomatic off-ramps, and engage constructively to end this conflict. It is also a time to summon our reserves of wisdom and experience to guide the way forward. Global solidarity means doing more than focusing on conflicts in some parts of the world while ignoring others. We need to shift our mindset from conflict management to conflict resolution. Our collective security depends on it. Let this crisis be the wake-up call. The future of this organization may rest on that. We all need to galvanize UN efforts to promote the dialogue, work towards an end to the hostilities, and address the humanitarian situation for those most desperately in need. The UAE recognizes the need to meet this moment with renewed diplomacy and leadership, and put the needs of the people on the ground at the center of our efforts. The avenues for dialogue must, however, remain open more urgently than ever before, and we must pursue them together. Mr. President, right now we recognize that this resolution adopted here today is a necessary signal of where we need to be going. Resigning ourselves to a cycle of perpetual violence and sanctions that only adds to the suffering of civilians diminishes us all. We voted for this resolution, and we join with member states in making this appeal to peace, a just peace that endures by recognizing the legitimate concerns of all parties and also abides by the UN's charters of principles and independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity. This resolution, however, as others have said, is not enough for a sustainable peace. Resolution of this conflict requires dialogue and effective diplomacy. This text represents the determination of member states to respond to the conflict today in Ukraine. That is the call that rings clearly from this meeting. We must now turn to finding ways to bring about its peaceful resolution with full respect for and commitment to real and engaged diplomacy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India has been deeply concerned over the rapidly deteriorating situation in Ukraine and the ensuing humanitarian crisis. An Indian national was tragically killed in Kharkiv yesterday due to the ongoing hostilities. We express our deepest condolences to his family and to that of each and every innocent civilian who has lost his or her life in this conflict. We demand safe and uninterrupted passage for all Indian nationals, including our students who are still stranded in Ukraine, particularly from Kharkiv and other cities in the conflict zones. Many member states share this concern. We have reiterated this demand to both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This remains our foremost priority. Ensuring the well-being and safety of our citizens is the basic duty of every government. We have therefore instituted special flights to bring back Indians home from conflict zones. My government has deployed senior ministers as special envoys to countries neighboring Ukraine to facilitate evacuation. We thank all neighboring countries of Ukraine for opening their borders and extending all facilities to our embassies at this time. India has already dispatched humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. This includes medicines, medical equipment, and other relief material. We are sending more such tranches in the coming days. India supports the international community's call for an immediate ceasefire. We also support safe humanitarian access to conflict zones. We remain firm in our conviction that differences can only be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi has unequivocally conveyed this in his discussions with world leaders, including of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. He underscored the urgent imperative for humanitarian access and movement of stranded civilians. We therefore sincerely hope that the second round of talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine will lead to a positive outcome. India urges that all member states demonstrate their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, to international law, and respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Keeping in view the totality of the evolving situation, India decided to abstain. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
Thank you, President. We voted in favor of the draft resolution A/ES/11/L1 based on our strong conviction of the importance of the principles of the UN Charter, particularly the principles of good neighborliness and peaceful resolution of conflicts, but also the principle of respect for the independence and territorial integrity of all countries. The Kingdom of Bahrain underscores its support for all efforts that seek to end hostilities and for dialogue to resume and use all diplomatic means necessary to achieve peace. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bahrain, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea is taking the floor in explanation of vote after the vote on the draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. Eritrea firmly believes that respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, are sacrosanct principles and should be respected by everyone at all times for the attainment of sustainable world peace. Eritrea's vote is demonstration of its uncompromising stand for peace. Its position is against internationalizing, incessant rhetoric, and imposition of unilateral sanctions, which regrettably further polarize international relations and escalate the situation with enormous implications for civilians. Instead, we have consistently opted for world regions to be given the needed space and solidarity to address political problems. The situation between Russia and Ukraine raises serious concern with political, economic, and security ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world. It requires immediate resolution by giving more chance to diplomacy. We hope that the ongoing talks between the two parties on the Belarusian border yields a quick and acceptable agreement to stop the war and pave a foundation for peace in the region. Eritrea opposes all forms of unilateral sanctions as illegal and counterproductive. Eritrea, the country that has been subjected to such measures by the West for 2 decades, including new sets of unilateral measures, understands that sanctions do not resolve problems of peace and security. On the contrary, they only hurt innocent people and undermine the road to peace. It will be remiss if I don't address disturbing reports that African citizens living in Ukraine are facing difficulty to cross the borders. We call on all countries to facilitate safe passage to people fleeing for safety regardless of their racial identity. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating that, that Eritrea would like to see that the windows for diplomacy remain open. We are confident of the ability of the parties to resolve their differences and reach an outcome that meets the interests and concern of all. We hope that the international community constructively support the parties in their search for sustainable peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Eritrea, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran is following the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine with grave concern. We reiterate our principled position regarding the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and underline the need for full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter, international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected, and the safety and security of all civilians must be guaranteed. In order to find long-term and sustainable solutions to such crises, it is necessary to address their root causes. We note that the current complexities in the fragile region of Eastern Europe have been exacerbated by the provocative actions and decisions of the US and NATO. The security concerns of Russia must be respected. Wars and destructions inflicted on civilian lives and infrastructures are not acceptable. Wherever they occur, The Islamic Republic of Iran calls for urgent cessation of hostilities and the escalation of tensions in the current conflict. In this regard, Iran underlines the essentiality of dialogue to address issues of concerns to all sides, leading to long-term results. The UN must always avoid double standards, particularly when it's considering issues related to the maintenance of international peace and security. It is unfortunate to note that the UN, in particular the Security Council, has at times neglected this principle, which has undermined its credibility. A case in point is the Security Council's handling of the conflict in Yemen. Mr. President, we believe that the text of the resolution before the General Assembly lacks impartiality and realistic mechanisms for resolving the crisis through peaceful means. Furthermore, not all member states of the UN were given the opportunity to engage in negotiations on the text of the resolution. It should be emphasized that the General Assembly is not in a position to determine the existence of an act of aggression because, in addition to Article 39 of the Charter, GA Resolution 3314 of 14 December 1974 calls on the Security Council to determine the existence of an act of aggression. Moreover, convening the emergency special session based on the General Assembly Resolution 377A shall not be considered as the end of the dialogue. My government continues to call for a comprehensive, peaceful, and sustained resolution to the current conflict, including an immediate ceasefire and a start of the dialogue, as well as provision of humanitarian assistance to the people in need. For the above-mentioned reasons, my delegation abstained from voting on the resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Shukran.
Thank you, Mr. President. Egypt would like to reiterate the following points with regards to the draft resolution that has been adopted and for which we have voted positively out of our belief in the principles and values of international law and the goals of the UN Charter. First, finding a swift political settlement to end this crisis through dialogue and peaceful means and through an active diplomacy should be our common goal and should remain the goal of the whole international community when dealing in the current crisis. And we should also allow room to achieve this main goal through our endeavors. Second, Egypt reiterates that we should not disregard the necessity of dealing with the root causes of the current crisis and dealing with them in order to defuse the crisis and achieve peace and stability. 3, Egypt rejects the exploitation of economic sanctions outside the multilateral international mechanisms because previous experiences have shown that such sanctions can have dire humanitarian consequences and lead to escalating the sufferings of civilians. 4, all parties should live up to their responsibilities and guarantee the flow of humanitarian assistance to all those in need without any form of discrimination, and they should also guarantee the free movement of the residents across the borders because we have had reports of discriminatory treatments in that regard. 5, Egypt warns of the economic and social consequences of the current crisis on the global economy. The global economy is still suffering the consequences of the pandemic, and the disruption in the supply chains and the international aviation is the best proof. 6, the effectiveness and credibility of the international multilateral mechanisms in facing the different crises and challenges depends on how we deal with all the international crises based on the same standards and criteria in line with the UN Charter and its objectives without consecrating the status quo and humanitarian sufferings for decades. And thank you.
Thank the distinguished representative of Egypt, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to deliver the explanation of vote of my country, Algeria. في الوقت الذي يتابع فيه بلاد
At a time when my country, Algeria, is closely following the development of the situation and the escalation in Ukraine, my delegation would like to emphasize once again that Algeria is committed to the principles and the objectives of the United Nations, which should remain the basis of international law and a cornerstone in international relations, especially the respect of the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the member states according to the international legitimacy and the right of people to self-determination. And in line with our positions calling for enhancing multilateralism and safeguarding it, and also in line with our commitment to developing amicable relationships among countries based on peaceful coexistence and the peaceful settlement of conflicts and the mutual respect of international commitments and security guarantees, my country, Algeria, can only join all the other efforts and diplomatic calls aiming at de-escalating the current situation and adopting dialogue in order to foster peaceful coexistence among nations to safeguard international peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Republic of Tanzania.
Mr. President, the United Republic of Tanzania has decided to abstain this resolution as a matter of principle and in defense of the UN Charter. Fundamentally, this decision resulted from our inability to amend or make reservations to some provisions in the resolution. We were convinced that there was a need to adjust the draft resolution. The United Republic of Tanzania believes that diplomacy is the best way to end this conflict. To this end, we appeal to all parties to the dispute to uphold human rights and their obligations under international law and humanitarian law to de-escalate the conflict and give peace a chance. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Republic of Tanzania, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we thank you for giving us the opportunity to take the floor to elaborate on South Africa's decision to abstain on today's resolution. Mr. President, let me reiterate our position expressed during the discussions of the emergency special session over the last few days. Firstly, by highlighting that South Africa remains deeply concerned by the escalation of conflict in Ukraine and the regional and international socioeconomic implications. We strongly urge all sides to uphold international law, including humanitarian law and human rights law, as well as the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, President, the conflict involves two members of the United Nations in an armed conflict, which this organization has at its foundation the responsibility to prevent. The United Nations, therefore, must take decisions and actions that will lead to a constructive outcome conducive to the creation of sustainable peace between the parties. The resolution that we have considered today does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. While we agree with and support the efforts taken by member states to bring to the attention of the international community the situation in Ukraine, South Africa feels that greater attention should have been paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue. For South Africa, the text in its current form could drive a deeper wedge between the parties rather than contributing to a resolution of conflict. The resolution should have welcomed the commencement of negotiations between the parties. Additionally, the role of the Security Council, as well as the good offices of the UN Secretary General, could have been given more prominence in the resolution. It is understood that one of the root causes of conflict is related to the security concerns of the parties. This should have been addressed in the resolution. Even though this emergency special session of the General Assembly is being held after the failure of the Security Council to address the matter, we believe that the Security Council should still be urged to play its role as mandated by the Charter to maintain international peace and security. South Africa believes that the UN, especially in the context of emergency special sessions, whose nature and significance speak to the gravity of the issues we bring before the international community, should be used as a platform to build bridges, address the divergence of views, provide recommendation and support for the parties to engage with a spirit of compromise, while de-escalating tensions, committing to the cessation of hostilities, and building trust and confidence. Unfortunately, the text before us did not do that. South Africa will have also preferred an open and transparent process to negotiate the resolution today. This would have allowed all of us, as equal members of the Assembly, to present our views and ideally reach a level of understanding before the text was tabled. As member states of the organization committed to global peace and development, we must continue to work together to promote peace. Gestures that merely create the impression of promoting peace without meaningful action will not assist. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Lebanon voted yes on this resolution because Lebanon, a founding member of the United Nations, believes in the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, especially the prohibition of the threat or use of force in international relations, the principle of non-intervention, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Mr. President, these are not merely slogans for Lebanon. We lived through invasions, occupation, intervention in Lebanon's internal affairs, and experienced devastation, loss, and pain that we are still enduring its consequences today. That's why our decision today was not taken lightly. We know what happens in wars, but we also know that wars happen not only when people fail to prevent them, but most importantly, when the voices of war drown the cries for peace. Lebanon, a peace-loving nation, enjoys a good relationship and friendships with all parties to this conflict, with Russia and Ukraine. And in this spirit, we call on everybody to go back to the logic of peace. Mr. President, yesterday, a European colleague told me he has never lived through war. I was happy for him. I lived through at least 2 invasions, a civil war, multiple assassinations, and explosions. That's why, Mr. President, I don't want anybody to live in what we lived through. It's time for diplomacy, for dialogue, and a peaceful resolution of this conflict. I hope that all my colleagues here in this GA hall will put the same energy and commitment that was put to make this vote and its result a reality, to start working for a peaceful resolution that takes both sides' concerns and interests into consideration, so the world will step away from this abyss of war. Mr. President, the preamble of the United Nations Charter tells us, quote, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security. Now we need this unity. Unity for peace. The United Nations is well positioned to step up and step in to make this peace a reality. Now we need to stop the escalation in words and deeds and help both sides to take the path of peace for the sake not only the two sides, but for the sake of our world. Mr. President, we in the Middle East are very concerned about this war because of its impact on Europe, but also because we know from experience what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. That the last two world wars left deep scars in our part of the world, obliterated countries and hopes, and we are still living its aftermath today. I hope, Mr. President, we all learn the lessons of the last wars, and I hope that from this moment, we start working only for peace. Peace in our time, peace in all time, as a former president of the United States said. Mr. President, I agree with Albert Camus in his speech upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature in 1957, that probably, and as a quote, every generation sees itself as charged with remaking the world. Mine, however, knows that it will not remake the world, but its task is perhaps even greater, for it consists in keeping the world from destroying itself. This is the same responsibility bestowed on us as the Charter instructed us to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, as a member of the family of nations, Malaysia is committed to the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations and the ideals it espouses. We reiterate the inviolability of the fundamental principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country and peaceful settlement of disputes in the maintenance of international peace and security, as well as global prosperity. All parties must uphold these fundamental and sacrosanct principles of the UN Charter and international law that guide the conduct of friendly relations between nations and peaceful coexistence. Many will agree that the resolution before us is far from perfect. While my delegation continues to have concerns with some of the language contained in the resolution, Malaysia voted in favor of it as a matter of principle and out of our strong conviction of the aforementioned principles. Mr. President, Malaysia values its strong and close relation with Ukraine and Russia. We believe the differences and legitimate security concerns of both parties, given the complex geopolitical context, must be addressed through dialogue and peaceful means in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter and rule of law. In this context, we welcome the direct talks held between Russia and Ukraine in Belarus and urge both sides to continue on the peaceful path to prevent further loss of life and destruction. From the vivid discussion at this emergency special session, what stood out glaringly to us as an overwhelming desire for the current conflict to be peacefully resolved. The Assembly has spoken with a clear and fervent voice on the matter today. Now, more than ever, the Security Council has to live up to its primary responsibility as the custodian of international peace and security. Malaysia calls on the Security Council to spare no effort in resolving this conflict. Mr. President, the future of humanity is at a precipice. Humanity must prevail, and peace is the only answer. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my delegation is distressed by the ongoing violence and conflict in Ukraine. Conflict anywhere inflicts stress everywhere. Nepal is a peace-loving country, as its soil is consecrated by the birth of Lord Buddha, and apostle of peace. For us, values of peace, harmony, and peaceful coexistence are our way of life, so they are supremely precious. Norms of world peace, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-aggression as enshrined in the UN Charter are the fundamentals of our foreign policy. The use of force against Ukraine goes contrary to these values and principles. Nepal opposes this violation of international law and the principles of UN Charter. Mr. President, there is no alternative to diplomacy and dialogue, to building peace and sustaining it. Nepal welcomes the second round of talk between Russia and Ukraine. We urge both sides to continue the dialogue with utmost sincerity and integrity to resolve this conflict peacefully and find a lasting political solution for their enduring peace and peace for the Europe. Based on Nepal's principled position on the inviolability of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of any state under international law, rules-based international order, and United Nations Charter, my delegation has voted yes on the draft resolution that was before us today. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have requested the floor to justify our vote. Iraq abstained in this vote on resolution A/ES-11/L1. Iraq regrets the deterioration of the situation and the escalating tensions between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And Iraq calls upon all parties to settle this conflict by giving priority to dialogue and through the diplomatic means. And we invite them to go back to negotiations in order to solve their concerns and in order to safeguard international peace and security, and not to threaten the world with economic and political crises resulting from this situation. Iraq expresses its grave concern over the possibility for the terrorists of exploiting this crisis and the expected division in the international community. This would hinder the international efforts and our joint endeavors aiming at preventing terrorism and violent extremism. Iraq has decided to abstain because of our historical background in Iraq and because of our sufferings resulting from the continuing wars against our peoples. Iraq, and in principle, does not support wars as a settlement mechanism. And we reiterate that all conflicts should be settled peacefully in order to safeguard the lives of civilians. Iraq calls upon all parties to uphold the UN Charter and international law, and emphasizes the necessity of safeguarding the security and safety of the international staff and the humanitarian workers. And thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iraq, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Jordan has voted for the draft resolution that has been adopted in order to emphasize the sovereignty of states and their territorial integrity and political independence, and because we believe that force should not be used in international relations because it goes against the provisions of international law and the UN Charter. Jordan hopes that we will be de-escalating tensions in order to reach a peaceful end of this conflict, and that both parties will sit together on the negotiation table in order to reach such a peaceful settlement. We also hope that international efforts will be intensified on both the political and diplomatic levels to assist the parties to end this crisis, and in order to avoid the dire consequences that have risen and could arise out of this conflict. And we would like to reiterate that all parties, and I insist all parties, should respect the international humanitarian law, human rights, and the international refuge law without any discrimination. To conclude, Jordan would like to remind of the necessity of respecting the international law provisions and the UN Charter, whereas force should not be used against other countries and peoples, and should not be used against the right to self-determination, and that a single standard should be implemented regardless of the region concerned and without any discrimination in implementing international criteria and standards. And we hope that this would lead to an effective dialogue inside the organization in order to implement this approach and to assess the current approach and to reach our common goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the distinguished representative Jordan. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote after the vote. We will now hear statements after the adoption of the resolution. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, last week the UN Security Council was prevented to act against Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression on Ukraine because of one isolated vote, that of the Russian Federation. Immediately after that, we initiated work Charter applies to all equally. Over the past days, the brutality of Russia's invasion with the complicity of Belarus has reached unimaginable levels, with indiscriminate attacks against Ukrainian cities causing death and destruction among civilians in complete disregard of international law. Distinguished colleagues and friends, this is not just about Ukraine. This is not just about Europe. This is about defending an international order based on rules we have all signed up to, the sovereign equality of all states, large and small. This is about whether we choose tanks and missiles or dialogue and diplomacy. Today's historic vote clearly shows Russia's isolation from the rest of the international community. By voting overwhelmingly in favor of the resolution, we have chosen to defend peace where Russia has chosen brutal aggression. We have chosen to defend this organization and its charter where Russia has violated the fundamentals of both. Russia stands increasingly alone. The European Union and the world stand with the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Mr. President, from all corners of the world, we have come together to send a resounding yes to uphold international law and the UN Charter, a resounding yes to the principle of the sovereign equality of all UN member states,
a resounding yes to the need to respect the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of all UN member states. A resounding message to Ukraine and all Ukrainians. In the words of a colleague who spoke yesterday, you are not alone. We stand with you today, tomorrow, and until peace prevails and Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity are fully restored and respected. We have also sent a clear message to Russia and to Belarus. Stop the aggression now. Full stop. What you are doing is unacceptable. It is wrong. Your unprovoked aggression against Ukraine is a violation of the core principles that you signed up to when you laid the foundation of this very organization, of this community of nations. Your invasion of Ukraine deserves our strongest condemnation. You will be held accountable, and every legal avenue available must and will be used to hold the aggressor to account. You must stop the war immediately. You must return your troops to Russia. You must return to the path of peace, of genuine dialogue. It is not too late to stop. It is not too late to reverse the course. It is not too late for you to return to this community where we believe, with all our faults and imperfections, in the principle of the sovereign equality of all. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the grave unfolding humanitarian crisis. We demand that all parties fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, protect civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, and ensure the safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access and passage. Humanitarian and medical personnel, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities, must be protected. Mr. President, thousands of civilians have been killed, more have been injured, and close to 1 million innocent civilians have been forced to flee across borders. Even more have been internally displaced inside Ukraine. They are in need of help and assistance without delay, without hindrance and preconditions. And we take this opportunity to salute and express our deepest respect, appreciation, and admiration for the generous assistance and protection that Ukraine's neighbors have shown to all those fleeing the conflict, men, women, and children from all corners of the world. Once again, we conclude by echoing the words of a peaceful protester who had written on her sign, "If Russia stops fighting, there will be no more war. If Ukrainians stop fighting, there will be no more Ukraine." I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank you for convening this historic emergency special session of the General Assembly, a session that was called because the Security Council failed once again to fulfill its primary responsibility. A session that was convened due to the unjustified, illegal, and illegitimate act of aggression against a founding member of the United Nations by a permanent member of the very organ entrusted by the entire membership with preserving peace and security. A session that was held as a result of the use of veto power by the very member that's perpetrating the aggression. Mr. President, we are obliged to reiterate, Russia's ongoing military offensive against Ukraine blatantly violates the fundamental rules of international law and the principles on which this august organization was founded. Rules and principles that aim to prevent wars and protect mankind from disastrous consequences. Consequences that we are unfortunately witnessing in and around Ukraine due to Russia's attacks. The international community could not have been spectators to such an act of aggression. I am proud that as of today, it is not. With today's resolution, the United Nations emphasizes loud and clear that it stands against egregious violations of the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political unity of fellow member states. The membership is committed to preserving the